Hi there, everyone. Welcome to this podcast webinar interview with us here at Lucinity and our friends and partners at Sift. The topic for discussion today is around phishing, fake accounts, fraud, obviously very much de rigueur or of the moment. I am joined today by somebody who really knows what they're talking about. I am delighted to introduce Brittany. Brittany, hi, good to, well, we met 5 minutes ago, but good to see you.
That's all right. And the pressure is already on somebody who knows what she's talking about. But yeah, I'm happy to be here.
I mean, look, that's in direct contradistinction to me. So I think we're off to a good start there. So Brittany, I know you're a bit of you are, I suppose, what we would say a gamekeeper turned poacher, right? Going from industry onto the vendor side of things. I was hoping maybe you could give us a bit of your background to get started.
Yeah, I mean, it does feel othered when you're at a conference and all of a sudden those merchant-only mixers, the merchant-only sessions that you used to be able to walk into are now completely off limits. But at the same time, I kind of started out my time at Sift as a trust and safety architect by introducing myself as a former merchant. But over the years, I've dropped that moniker. I don't say former anymore, not only because a majority of my experience was spent on the merchant side fighting fraud, but just I always still have that mindset. And I think that that's sort of indicative of my role here at Sift anyway, because that's my job, to be a fraud expert, to advocate for merchants, and to be able to have conversations like this where we bring up really important current topics, like you said, phishing, and how that's improving, and what fraudsters are doing to take advantage of tons and tons of people worldwide. I kind of lost track even of what the most recent total was for estimated money lost to fraudsters via social engineering scam. I know it's in the billions, but maybe it's even gone into the trillions. I don't even know if you have that number, but it's always a staggering amount.
Yeah, and I think it's something that is in distinction to, I think, a lot of perception around financial crime, right? We think about money laundering, we think about cartels, we think about, the geopolitics of it, the sanctions regime, etc. But then fraud is very much where humans are, right? Not necessarily just these faceless, difficult to comprehend sort of institutions.
Yeah, and it also affects everybody. I don't know if I've ever met anyone who hasn't gotten a scam text, whether that's pretending to be a delivery service saying that you need to click here to update your address, or pretending to be your boss saying, please send me gift cards, I'm at an event. I actually have a friend who has fallen for that one, unfortunately. They had a very eccentric boss who was known for sending sort of off-the-wall requests via text at any hour. The boss was not a native English speaker and would sometimes use sort of unpredictable syntax or writing,
Sure.
and would be just the kind of person to say, I'm at a dinner, can you send me 3 gift cards? And so they did it. It was also a very small company. And that person lost $300 because they bought those gift cards and sent it to the fake boss. Now, another important reason to bring this up as we get into a conversation on phishing and scam victims is that that friend of mine tried to rectify this in what he thought was the correct manner by then reaching out to his credit card company, telling them what happened, and trying to get a refund for those gift cards that he purchased. And he was told, no, you agreed to make that purchase. You participated in this transaction. It's not fraud. It's not an unauthorized charge.
Yeah.
They were able to get the gift cards turned off, because I believe they then called Visa. I think they were, standard sort of vanilla gift cards. Yeah. But he couldn't get his money back. And we've actually seen, looking in forums where consumers communicate, like on Reddit and other social media sites, actually seeing them warning other people, if this happens to you, lie.
Yeah.
Do not tell your credit card company the truth that you were a victim of fraud, because they won't give you the money back because you willingly sent it away. Now, I know there are differences in international rules. The UK has a much more consumer friendly approach to even
Recently,
APP fraud. Yeah.
recently.
Yeah. But
Yeah.
actually, they were trying to pass something kind of similar here in the US that might have put more guardrails on Zelle that was recently just dropped. And so we're going to be persisting throughout the rest of this year, if not for many more years, in that environment where, scam victims aren't even comfortable telling their credit card company what really happened. And
Yeah.
that's very unfortunate.
The some of the new guidance around APP. I mean, let's be clear. It shifted a lot over quite a short space of time in the run up to, what was the date? Was it October 10th or October 7th, I think, last year?
Last year.
And there was a lot of, not necessarily flip-flopping, but the contingent reimbursement model. It's like, is it going to be up to £400,000 between the acquirer and the back? So yeah, I think it's fair to say that it's still highly prevalent, and I think frankly growing. And I actually think a lot of the basis of our conversation today, to your point earlier around AI, is obviously hugely prevalent in this, right? So we at Lucinity use AI as a means of making financial crime investigators and investigations more efficient, more effective. They've got better access to context and automating processes, etc. I know you at Sift have just a huge amount of experience in using machine learning techniques and AI models to detect fraud kind of in real time as well as post fact. But we have to be right all the time, right? And the fraudsters can just continuously experiment. So it'd be great just to hear from your perspective first. How has that evolved in the sort of 15 years that you've been in the space? What are some of the kind of, I guess, mitigation strategies that you've come up with historically, and then maybe almost counterintuitively with the rise of AI, why don't those strategies work anymore?
Got it. So a lot, has happened in the 15 years that I've been in fraud prevention. I remember identifying my first money laundering ring on a marketplace that I worked on just by putting together all of the different usernames that I found connected to each other and realizing that certain buyers only ever bought from these particular sellers who we'd identified as being problematic. Now, this was a time when that platform did not process payments, so I didn't get any help from a financial institution or anyone else, giving me that feedback. But just seeing that spiderweb and network, I didn't go to school for fraud prevention, so I didn't even know what I was looking at, and had to figure out that money laundering was a possibility on a platform like that. So, I've definitely started from the, I guess you'd say, Stone Age of notebooks, of paper notebooks with all of that. But what I've seen for AI, especially taking off in the last 3 years, as far as fraudsters having their accessibility to it, is just that. There's more easy access, more knowledge of it existing. There could have been fraudsters who were using it far in advance of 2020 or 2022 or so, when it became even more in the public consciousness. But now it's something where everybody seems to be able to access. I was actually just recently applying for a graduate program, and before I could even submit any content, I had to accept this big warning saying I would not use AI to generate any part of my application, because they would identify it, and then they would prevent me from using that tool, right? So that kind of then leads me into another point of the evolution, is that I'm wondering how much of fraudsters' approaches are now far more homogenized, where a lot of them are using those same tools, getting those same responses. We always harp on the fact that fraudsters can use AI to improve their written language via text scams, or to have better live chat and communication with victims. But if it all starts sounding exactly the same, could it then potentially be even more simple for us to identify, or at least we'll be more certain? You said you have to be right 100% of the time. Will we be more certain when it has that more homogenous look? And one more call out I want to make before maybe we pause and I get you to get me back on track with your 3-part question, is that I still think there's so much need to have a human set of eyes in the fraud review process, whether that is something that's a little bit more manual or at least some kind of QA and spot checking. I recently saw somebody post on LinkedIn about how easy it was to use an AI image generator to spin up a person holding an ID.
Yeah.
And they gave about 5 or 6, assorted options, but none of them to me were convincing, because I've worked in fraud prevention for 15 years. And I have never seen somebody who completed an ID check have like a friend take a portrait quality style photo of them where the background is lightly blurred.
Yep.
99 out of 100 people will just take a selfie.
Yep.
And it'll be a close cropped, slightly poor quality selfie with the ID more in focus.
Yep.
Whereas these were lovely little portrait shots of people with the ID far away and in some cases slightly blurred. So that would never trick me in a human set of eyes looking at that picture. But I acknowledge that the AI could learn from that, could get that feedback, and could improve as well.
Well, so rather than getting us back on track into my three-part question, actually, something that there's two things I think that you touched on there are really, really interesting. So the first is this sort of homogenized playbook approach to fraud, right? And I think we all know about, less so the Silk Road these days, but certainly the ability to buy, everything from credit card numbers to big books of potential victims on the dark web, etc. But I guess I'd not really considered that actually, hey, steal my strategy is something that maybe these fraudsters are sharing around. And I'm guessing that probably social media, Snapchat, etc., plays a big part in that. Maybe you could just give a little bit more of, what you've seen on that side of things.
Oh, let's jump into the world of fraud as a service, which are fraudsters who are able to have their full-time job be helping others commit fraud. And that has something really took off in 2020 when so many people staying at home switched to being online. The opportunity to commit fraud in stores, just via shoplifting or any other manner, faded away and it all became online. There had existed fraud as a service before that, but that's when it really took off and we saw them push more with marketing, push more with sales and offers. And they are able to not only share methods, so suggestions of how to attack a particular site, they are then also able to sell tools. And one of those tools for the use of, let's say, testing a platform or just trying to see, what credit cards might work on a platform or logins might work on a platform would be using a config, like a silver bullet config, or there's a open bullet config. There's a few other options. Now, with those, they're generally sold by those fraudsters, and it's a piece of software where then when you're able to use it, you can take those username and password combinations, put them in, select a site you want to try them against, or the config is already particular for just one site. And once you run it, it'll tell you how many of those logins worked and potentially some more information if the config goes a bit further past login to, let's say, confirm a credit card is on file. So there are those available. Now, when fraudsters are getting more into their business world and are looking for, incentives or ways to get more customers, they'll sometimes share these configs for free. And those will pop up and are easily searchable in Telegram channels, on certain dark web marketplaces. And that's where a fraud fighter like myself could step in. And if you wanted to protect your company, you would find a config for your company and then start stripping out specific pieces of information that you could use within your fraud prevention process, knowing that the fraudsters who are sort of at the bottom of the totem pole or are looking for something, easily accessible and don't want to pay just yet might be grabbing those free configs to test them out. So you can pull out the user agent. You might be able to pull out very interesting combinations of browser language and other settings. I'm not trying to give away too much here. Exactly how to do that, but you could pull those out and plug those in. And at the very least, anyone who uses that config that has been floating around for a few months will now have a harder time testing credentials on your platform. So it's beneficial for entry-level fraudsters to already be able to find a mentor potentially, but on what's widely available and free, they can then easily sort of be swatted away as long as the merchant knows that that vulnerability exists.
So these vulnerabilities, these exploits, because I assume that we're not talking here about one or two username password combos, right?
Right.
We'll be talking about banks of thousands and thousands and thousands of them. Obviously, we see occasionally in the news that there's been a big data breach or something like this, but to bring the kind of conversation back to that social engineering aspect, like out of, let's say, these thousands of these configs, as you call them, like how many of these will have just been generated through social exploitation, or is it more of a throw enough dirt approach in that context?
Yeah, so the fraudsters who are selling these configs, they also very often will also sell a batch of credentials to use for it, but also some of those credentials may be for free to test. The most common number I generally see is for them to be in batches of 5 or 10,000 available just for free. And they'll usually then hone in on one particular email domain that fraudster either bucket the credentials in or was just able to better phish or test. But when you go back to those phishing sources, so not even thinking about data breaches, they can be messages to people, like my phone beeping just a second ago. Those might have been spam texts. We don't know. But it also could be via email, or it could be via a phishing site. So people could fall for an email that seems like it's from a company they trust, seems like it's from a brand they trust, but also they could be clicking through a link that a good friend shared on a social media platform, unknowing that that good friend had their account compromised, and that's a malicious link. And it could be something like, I got this loyalty link where only 10 of my friends are able to get, I'll use the stereotypical example, Ray-Bans for, 80% off. And someone clicks it, logs in to the account via that checkout flow, and they can just sit there and scrape the username and passwords that come through. Or, it could be a version of a man-in-the-middle attack, where in the end, they actually do get passed along to the legitimate site after clicking on a spammy link. But the most important thing to call out about those is that when those credentials are found, rarely does the person who was the victim actually realize that something bad has happened. Like maybe they will click through that Ray-Ban link and then just get a response that says, oh no, this has already been redeemed 10 times. Sorry. Maybe they'll eventually not get the item that they thought they purchased, but it'll take them a week or more to realize that it's not going to arrive in the mail. It's not an immediate realization. Oh, I need to go change my password to my email account. That's already available. Now, some of the fraudsters who phish those credentials will use them quickly. Others will repackage them for sale. The ones who use them quickly, there's so much you can get out of someone's email account. And I'll give one example. When buy now, pay later providers really blew up like 4 years ago, we saw fraudsters selling access to email accounts where they had already checked to see which buy now, pay later providers that person had emails from, indicating they had an account. And they were selling the ones where the people had 4 or more buy now, pay later accounts open, and marketing them that way, saying, look at this line of credit you can get just from this email because they've got 4 of those providers already spun up.
That's really interesting from obviously a kind of process perspective, but particularly from the demography of the victims, right? We hear a lot about, victims being typically older people. And then, but to your point about the, BNPL being a real channel for this, also, unfortunately, people who are less financially secure, right? These are the people that are more easily preyed upon because they are looking for a solution.
Yeah. And if you want to talk about, those emails going out or something that might be social engineering, tricking somebody into becoming a mule, for example, and helping a fraudster commit financial fraud. I mean, I've seen that for so many years. I at one point worked for a marketplace that had a job listings platform, and we had a constant battle against fraudsters who would be listing jobs, claiming that they needed a assistant for usually an elderly aunt or a disabled grandfather who couldn't go to the bank and deposit checks on his own.
Yeah.
And so they were looking, therefore, for someone to kind of take that hit if the check was identified as fraud in person at the bank. So they wanted a mule. And we would see people kind of get tricked by that, thinking, oh, this is an easy assistant job. But we also saw people who would message that fraudster and say, yeah, I know what this is. You don't have to lie to me. Because they had either done it before or were just familiar with that process, and they were fully willing to become a mule. And to give you an example of how difficult it can be to work in fraud prevention on a platform like that, how do you then correctly identify whether someone was an innocent victim who truly thought they were being a kind personal assistant helping out an elderly aunt, and how many people were also in on it well enough that they knew the scam and should also have some sort of action taken against their account?
Yeah. And that particular, I was about to say use case, but that particular example that you give there, I think has become so much more prevalent here in the UK of people willingly, especially young people, students, willingly signing up to become mules because it's advertised on social media as make £500 today, right? All you need is an ID and a clean bank account, and we'll give you £500. And I think they don't necessarily realize the long-term implications of what that's going to do from everything from credit
but also
yeah.
I was gonna say also, I don't know how close we are in age. I'm assuming we're roughly millennials, if not elder millennials, in that same bucket. Whenever I'm speaking to a room of people who I can kind of
phrased.
Okay. Well, I'm an elder millennial, so that's what I fall into. But whenever I speak to a room of people roughly my same age, I ask anybody, like, who here had a computer in college but didn't illegally download a song or a movie or a TV show? And I get very few hands.
Right.
We had our own version of sort of being in that gray area, a willingness to, quote, technically commit fraud. And what did we do? Well, we justified it. We said, yeah, the artists do not get their fair share of the money made from this content. So you know what I'm going to do is I'm just going to illegally download it and then stick it to the big corporations. Well, that same idea comes through with what you just described, with getting food delivered for free, with sort of anything that can be justified. I think that we can both be surprised that it's so ubiquitous, but we can also see what the mindset is and see how we can understand, because we were to a degree in those same shoes, just in a different manner 20 years ago.
For sure. So, okay. So thinking then about all of these examples that we've just given of kind of typologies, you've obviously been at the coalface of investigating them. And now you're trying to solve them with technology and with the techniques that you've picked up along the way. What does it? I'm a fraud analyst. What does my day look like?
Oh, so in that case, it's really going to depend on what kind of company you work for. But let's kind of just pick a mid-sized business where you've probably got access to some internal tooling, and then you've also probably got, let's say, an external fraud prevention solution like a Sift. You're not all in-house or just sort of scrambling. I have seen people fighting fraud with Excel spreadsheets. So we won't give that example. But in a normal situation, if you're a fraud analyst and you're coming in the morning, you should be looking at some sort of dashboard that gives you a summary of what the most important metrics are that should be trending in a particular way, day over day or week over week. And if there are any aberrations, like let's say a huge spike in failed payments, a huge spike in failed logins, a huge spike in accounts that end up being blocked by your system, that's something to hone in on and needs a bit of investigation to see what's going on. It could be completely legitimate. You had a credential stuffing attack and it was all taken care of, but it could also mean that some behavior had shifted and you might be over indexing on taking an action on your legitimate customers. And you can also then look at whether or not there's any sort of retroactive indicators of fraud. Have you gotten any chargeback disputes that have come through that indicate fraud that was missed within your system? Have you gotten any user complaints about accounts that were closed, which shouldn't have been? And that's part of a feedback loop. So you as that fraud analyst aren't just in your world on the fraud prevention team, but you're hearing from finance, from customer support, from a lot of different areas of your company. And so you have to interact with so many of those other siloed teams. And then if you're a higher sort of ranking analyst, in some cases, you'll have quite a few things escalated to you. Those really confusing gray area situations where it's not clearly a legit user, it's not clearly fraud, and you have to come up with what those variables are to then be able to determine how can we take it out of the gray area and make a decision, because you can't just let it sit indefinitely without a decision. And in that instance, a lot of the work could be manual, but hopefully you've also got the ability to use technology, like we've been saying the fraudsters have, being able to use both machine learning and AI to make that easier for you. So let's say using a machine learning model that can look at far more signals than you could look at on your own, but also maybe using an AI tool within that to stack rank the importance of those signals and to help you explain to management why you made the decision that you did when you either approved or denied a transaction.
So I think what's abundantly clear, and it's helpful because obviously it's a significant part of both of our respective value propositions here, is that human in the loop is absolutely integral, right? And that I wonder if you could comment on, obviously experience, expertise, judgment informs that human in the loop, right? But I wonder how big a part, and maybe you could comment on today and what it looks like in 5 years' time, because it might be interesting. How much of that is informed by, let's say, a base human instinct or empathy, right? And how much is informed by what the technology is telling us now?
Yeah, I'm always a big proponent of having that human in the loop, because I just feel like there is so much that we can notice. And if you've been at a company for even a year, in a startup, a year can be where you're already pretty tenured. You will know what fraud looks like or what to expect from your business. And that valuable internal knowledge is so beneficial when applied to fraud prevention. I once worked with a company where their most trustworthy and just best behaved users always access their platform via Tor.
Right.
The Tor browser, stereotypically associated with fraud and with bad guys, but they were a very privacy-focused website. And those users who use Tor were generally some of their most ardent supporters and their best behaved customers. No issues, no chargebacks, no nothing. So if they just come in with an outside lens and hadn't been custom in their thought process, then they might have rejected their most trustworthy users. So you've got that mindset and the ability to know what fraud should look like. But then you also just have some of that intuition where, if you remember the example I gave earlier of saying, well, nobody submits an ID and face photo as like a beautiful portrait. They take it as a selfie. I've even had that pop up in an example a couple of weeks ago. I was looking at a photo supposedly of a gym, like picture a lovely hotel gym.
Right.
And I said, this is a fake photo, because all of the weights in the weight rack were the same size. And you wouldn't have a weight rack with 10 of the same sets of dumbbells.
Yeah.
So to me, it popped out as not trustworthy. But if you don't get to see those little aberrations as a human, and maybe if you're just having a system, it wouldn't even consider looking that. It might just look at the integrity of the photo, look at the metadata, which might have been set to give the correct response back, and then throw in a thumbs up to that photo. So I think in 5 years' time, what I would love to have is more time available to that fraud analyst to do some of those deeper dives, to greatly improve processes. I even know of a company who got their ATO, or account takeover, recovery email NPS score, or Net Promoter Score, and that sentence had a lot of abbreviations in it. But basically the customer sentiment of the customer support they got after their account was ATO'd, they got that email to be the highest sentiment of any of their customer support emails in the company, because they rolled in education, they rolled in warnings, they made people feel safer in their entire experience online and not just on that website. But that kind of work can't happen if you've got your nose down and you're manually reviewing the same types of transactions from morning till night. So I hope in 5 years, the humans are there to continue to do that kind of rich, detailed work. And we've automated as much as we can in the background.
Yeah. One of my favorite words, and I find myself guilty of using it all the time, is quotidian, right? Doing just busy work, finding data, accessing data, rather than interpreting it and using it to make a decision. So no, it makes a lot of sense. Something that you touched on there, I thought was really interesting is, the amount of stakeholders that analyst will touch kind of cross-functionally across the organization. Right now, I'm not going to let you get away from this conversation without touching money laundering. And fortunately, you called it out right at the top there as, a junior analyst in your own in your own experience, kind of identifying a money laundering network. I'm interested, firstly, to throw another acronym out there, whether or not you're a staunch advocate for FRAML, which I've started to hear more over the last 12 months, or, do you believe that they are completely separate disciplines that should remain broadly separate, or do you believe in the amalgamation of those teams? How have you worked with AML teams in the past? Like, just give me your give me a précis on that.
FRAML. So I'm assuming that is fraud plus AML with a wonderful abbreviation.
What we need is another acronym, yeah.
Oh my gosh. I have some of my least favorite acronyms whenever I see them, but that one, fraud plus money. I think that fraud has struggled for decades to find its proper home within many organizations. It grew out of customer support, for example, in some orgs. In others, it broke off from finance, and some it was developed under legal. I myself, within my fraud prevention career, have reported up through customer support, operations, product, legal, marketing, even in one case. And there are other teams like InfoSec and cybersecurity that are now also pretty common to have fraud rolled into them. We're seeing a lot of fraud fusion. I'm most familiar with the fraud and cybersecurity fusion that has happened increasingly over the past few years. I actually teach a course pretty often for the Merchant Risk Council called Fraud 201. And at the beginning of each class, I have people raise their hands to indicate if they're from fraud, payments, risk, cybersecurity, or other. What do they identify as their team? And more have raised their hands for risk and cybersecurity that are interested enough in attending a class called Fraud 201. So I would say if the FRAML you described helps the fraud team do their job better, maybe gives them more access to product commitment, more access to being able to actually get what they need and get the job done, then I'm all for it, because in the end, it's stopping financial crime potentially for a platform. Now, let's say we're talking about that marketplace that I worked for years ago, where we also have a lot of content fraud and we have a lot of policy abuse and work. Yeah, maybe that's not the appropriate way to take the fraud team, because their job is not fully focused on financial crime. But I could see it working in some orgs. And then I want to ask you, have you seen it being successful? And what is your opinion on it?
Yeah, I mean, look, I work entirely within the sort of regulated financial services sector, right? So it's a much more natural kind of fit. I think the thing that really interests me in it is, from a business perspective and from an operational perspective, is money laundering can be more nebulous, right? Insofar as you're looking at longer patterns over longer periods of time, of a particular sort of transactional flow, shall we say, and the outcomes can be significant, right? Regulatory fines, reputational damage, so on and so forth. Whereas fraud almost feels that much more immediate, right? You feel
Mhm.
fraud on the bottom line, right? Whether it's by virtue of chargebacks or whatever the case may be, and you can be talking about millions, if not hundreds of millions of dollars felt in fraud that quarter. So I think there's an interesting dynamic between the way that fraud teams and AML teams typically work, insofar as what AML are doing can be informed by fraud and by
Absolutely. Yeah, there's another example I can give of another marketplace I worked at where the money laundering that we saw there was so well done as to have fake profiles that had conversations with each other, and even having sort of that equivalent of the demand side and supply side, having the demand side tell the supply side, oh, this gift had been for my anniversary, and we can't believe you included like the extra card and the extra flowers and the extra things to make it even better, and then leaving a positive review with a photo of those flowers and those extra things. I know I'm being vague when describing it, but I would see months and months and months of very detailed conversations and very detailed use of the site set up.
yeah,
And if the fraud team wasn't made aware that that was potentially risky and that could be indicative of money laundering, we weren't going to get any payment fraud signals from our side, because there were no chargebacks, there were no disputes, there were no consumer complaints,
mm,
because that's the nature of money laundering. As you know, you want to stay under the radar of
yeah,
any team who might be able to stop what you're doing. And so we would never see bad behavior from those accounts. But when we learned that that's what money laundering could look like, we could instead take our fraud approach and be able to analyze, let's say, a certain number from the demand side who only ever had a buyer come once, buy from them, and never buy from anyone again, and
yeah,
try to find all of those patterns, and
yeah,
then work closely, potentially in some kind of, prior version before it was called FRAML, of that kind of information sharing. But no, that's totally right. There are things within the purview of a fraud team that don't result in an immediate financial hit, but I don't think the AML team would be potentially as deep in reviewing accounts and reviewing for those patterns to maybe have the bandwidth to pick up on those. Because as I'm sure you're also familiar, if the people laundering money really want to stay under the radar, they may do it $100 at a time,
well, so,
just at a massive scale.
and this is where it's so important to have context, right?
Mm.
Context and understanding of, and it comes back to first principles in terms of financial crime detection, good solid KYC, right? Understand who your customers are,
Mm-hmm.
what they look like, what normal behavior looks like, and crucially, do we want to continue doing business with these customers?
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. So what does the next, and I'm conscious we've spoken probably you've given me more of an education in the last 25 minutes than really having a discussion per se on AI. But coming back to AI and how fraudsters are using it, weaving it into
Mm.
their social engineering techniques, combining it with, the mass market technology that makes face changing, voice changing more readily accessible to them. Like, what are those challenges that we're seeing now?
Mm-hmm.
How do we combat them? And what is going to be the next big challenge for fraud investigators?
So I think one challenge right off the bat is, oh yeah, I know, is is not assuming that all fraudsters will make the switch to immediately adopting and using AI. So I like to call out that in the year 2025, check fraud is still a problem, paper check fraud. So don't lose sight of old techniques that will still work. We've actually seen fraudsters in forums say, yeah, but the texts that I send still work. People still fall for a text they think is from their bank. Why would I upgrade that to an AI voice phone call sort of chat bot that I might run instead? It's not necessary. However, the fraudsters who are adopting those techniques and the technology that allows them to better commit social engineering attacks, I do think that they are learning extremely quickly. And we, on the fraud fighting side, have the disadvantage of needing to do our work in a compliant, in a well thought out, and potentially much slower manner. So I think wherever you can look to be nimble within that work and respond quickly. For example, if you want to make a change to your fraud prevention solution, can you do so with just a few clicks? Or do you need to file a ticket and wait 2 or 3 days for someone to say they've got it and complete it and update their, your entire approach? That is going to become far less sustainable. So for the future, I always encourage people to try to find a resource where you can stay educated on what's happening in the world of fraud, whether that is following certain experts on LinkedIn, an industry newsletter. I've even gotten really good with I have a Google Pixel, and it has a news section. If you swipe fully left, it'll give you headlines. I've really just completely trained it to tell me about fraud and AI and whatever else might interest me. And so I can do a quick swipe and see if anything interesting pops up. And when you're staying in tune with all of this industry news, think back onto how it applies to your job. And is there anything that you can do? So for example, we'll keep going back to that image of a person holding an ID.
Yeah.
You could then take that example and you could go to, let's say, your ID verification provider, if you use one, and say, are you seeing examples of this? And if so, what are you doing to stop them? How effective is your system? Keep those lines of communication open, ask those questions, and see how they respond, which then may inform, how good of a job you think they're doing and how you assess them when it comes time for contract renewal. So definitely use those resources, not just to educate yourself, but to make sure that the services who are working for you are actually doing so.
Well, that's a perfect example, and one that I don't know how we're doing for time. I've not been shouted at yet, I don't think. But it's a perfect opportunity and maybe a message to round off on, which is to say, we operate in an ecosystem, right? Financial crime is a shared problem requiring shared solutions. So that example you give there of ensuring that your IDV provider is capturing risk indicators that you need to inform your desire to do business with a person. Does that speak to your fraud solution? Is your AML team well geared to catch potential indicators coming through from your fraud team, from your KYC team, whatever it may be? I think that's the message, right? Is just know who you're doing business with and why.
Exactly. So are you dealing with some black box situations where you can't answer a question from leadership when they want to know what's going on? Or do you have that information at your fingertips? And I'd advocate for the latter just because that's my style.
Very succinctly done. Brittany, look, it's been such a pleasure, as I say, an education for me. I would go and I'm assuming you're followable on LinkedIn.
I am. And you're going to see me traveling for the next 3 weeks for lots of conferences. So if anybody's attending any spring fraud prevention conferences, you might actually see me there in person as well.
Fabulous. And likewise, I will be at Penningtvatsdagarna, which I'm getting better at saying, which is a Swedish money laundering conference next week. So thanks very much indeed again for joining me. And thanks indeed to you for joining us. Have a good rest of your week. Cheers.